Dr. LeBlanc, PhD, is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and Counseling Programs within Hunter College's School of Education, and is a co-founder of Hunter College's Urban Center for Assessment, Research, and Evaluation. For over 20 years, he has worked in the fields of teacher and leadership preparation. A developmental psychologist, Dr. LeBlanc's research investigates the impact of developmentally and culturally responsive teaching on school climate. This research has been published in both psychological and educational journals and has garnered awards from the Spencer Foundation and the American Psychological Association. Dr. LeBlanc is a sought-after speaker on the topic of developmentally and culturally responsive teaching and is the author of the book that I just referenced, Who's in My Classroom? Building Developmentally and Culturally Responsive School Communities, published by John Wiley and Sons. As an expert in the field of child and adolescent development, he has served as an educational consultant to school districts and has served as an evaluation consultant to nonprofit organizations, including the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Studies, the Roundabout Theater Company, the Misty Copeland Foundation, and of course with us in the Arthur Miller Foundation. In addition to being recognized for his research, Dr. LeBlanc has been recognized for his teaching and service in the field of teacher and leadership education. He is the past recipient of Hunter College's Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Hunter College Schools of Education's Harold Ladis Award for Excellence in Teaching, and is a past recipient of the Distinguished Service Award from the Association for Equality and Excellence in Education, Incorporated. Please welcome Dr. Gess LeBlanc. So we're just going to have a conversation. Full disclosure, we had a couple conversations beforehand. There's so much to share, and hopefully we'll have you back.
Oh, I'd love to.
But right now, we're just going to kind of focus a little bit on this idea of mindsets and being culture responsive, and find out a little bit more about your work. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about your background. Gess, can I call you Gess?
Of course.
Gess is not a theater person per se. So he comes to us from the perspective of a developmental educational psychologist who has found theater and found the relevance. So it's kind of interesting. We go the other direction. So maybe talk to a little bit about your approach.
So I'm a developmental psychologist, and so my interest is in how children develop cognitively, socially, emotionally, even physically. But I'm also a professor in a school of education. So I've thought a long time about just the impact of schools and the context of schools and informing how children develop. When I was at Cornell, I was actually taught by a professor by the name of Avery and he had a real big impact in terms of the way that I think about development. And so Dr. Bronfenbrenner talked a lot about this idea of development taking place within context. And so if we really want to understand how children or adolescents develop, we have to think about the context in which they lived and what those contexts did in terms of influencing how they developed. And so for me, schools was that context. If we think about how much time children spend in school, from preschool, by the time they're 4 years old, we have full day preschool. So we think about from preschool, 4 years, all the way up to about 18 or 19. Kids are in school for a long amount of time. And so for me, just really examining that context became really important for me. And so that's really been the focus of my work, is to really understand the school context, how it informs development. But one of the things that I then realized was that oftentimes when we talked about how schools were impacting children, we didn't spend a lot of time talking with the children themselves. Right? So we didn't have a lot of time really learning from students about just like, how does this place make me feel? What's this experience like for me? Right? And so for me, I had the opportunity to connect with the organization that Peter mentioned, which was Youth Communications, and that really provided me an opportunity to kind of dig deeper into youth voice. In my travels, I've had the opportunity in schools to also observe lots of different content areas, and one of them was theater. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but theater became that space where I noticed that it was addressing a lot of needs that I thought were not being met at other places what children were spending during school day. And so the theater context became one that I became just more and more interested in.
So let's stay there for a second.
Sure.
And talk about why theater? Why are you here with us today? I mean, you've got, your work is broad. We see the value of theater. Where do you see that?
So for me, my interest is around kind of bridging two fields. One is developmental psychology and the other is culturally responsive teaching. And so bringing those two things together, I thought that theater was that space where I could see children's developmental needs being met. So for example, this is just my bias, my own perspective, and I think that all of our students have developmental needs. So for example, a cognitive need, a need to be intellectually engaged. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people who say, these kids don't want to learn. I've never met a student who didn't want to learn something, right? Like they might not want to learn what I'm teaching them, right? But they want to learn something. So I think it's important for us to meet children's intellectual needs, their cognitive needs. I also think that we all have affective needs, we have emotional needs, need for emotional support. We need to be in a safe, supportive environment, right? That's how we're going to take risks. Students also have identity needs. They need to have a better sense of who they are, what they're good at, where they're going. Those are the kind of constant questions that are ruminating in their minds. But we also have physical needs, and we saw that even during the pandemic, a lot of sitting down, sitting in front of screens. So all of those needs, I think, are developmental needs, and when they're all met, I see higher levels of student engagement. And so for me, it's really about just thinking about what are the spaces during a school day where I see more of those needs being met. And essentially, I find those through theater classes.
And we have a slide above us. I don't know if you wanted to reference this in terms of your melding of the worlds.
Yeah. So that's just a way of examining how I'm connecting these two fields, right, as a developmental psychologist. One of the things that I think was mentioned in the intro as well was that I'm also an evaluator. So I do a lot of program evaluation, and I helped to found a center at Hunter some years ago. And so for me, it's always about trying to understand impact, really trying to capture what the impact of the work is. And so that's another piece that's been really interesting to me because I'm not a theater person. So I would meet with people in theater and they would talk about the work and talk about the children and say things like, the students' spirits were lifted or they were passionate. And I'm like, how do I measure that? Like, I don't understand quite, like, what does that mean? And then when I started to kind of find myself in the phenomenon, I kind of got what they were talking about. So then it became more incumbent upon me to try to put different kind of language to that, to be able to kind of capture that a bit more. And so through that work, I've been able to have the pleasure of going to lots of classrooms, a lot of theater classrooms. Maybe some of you here have been to your classroom, and I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the impact of your work on your students.
Yeah, so I'm going to share a phrase that Jess said while we were talking, and my heart just went like this. You guys ready for it? He said, the focus of my work is really on youth voice. Sound familiar? But he's focusing on youth voice, not necessarily in a theatrical sense, but in youth voice in terms of kind of their own agency in terms they live. Now we know that we address that in our work, and we see that kind of social emotional learning connection and being culture responsive. But talk to us a little bit about this kind of idea of youth voice and elements of SEL and how we go beyond that, et cetera.
So my work, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to read at least some of the books so far, you'll see that it's very much based on youth voice. I mean, that's one of the things I'm most proud about this book, is the number of stories that we have baked within it. And so as a developmental psychologist, I've often been frustrated by the fact that a lot of the writings, a lot of the work really doesn't center student voice. And for me, I noticed that it was really important to oftentimes just seek to understand. So my overriding question when I'm in schools is just like, what would happen if I just shut my mouth and listen? And when I give kids an opportunity to speak, they tell me a lot of things. I have the privilege right now of doing focus groups with schools and districts all around the metropolitan area. I always run out of time because the students always have a lot of things to share. It's like a running joke in the building where kids will follow me in the hallway and say, Dr. LeBlanc, don't forget to write this down. And I'm asking them basic things. And what I notice is there's oftentimes a disconnect between the things that teachers say impact their students and the things that students say impact them. Right? And so I'll talk with teachers and they'll say, oh, I do this practice, or I do this, I do that, and I really think it has a big impact on my students. I talk to the students, they're like, yeah, kind of not so much. But these are the other things that they do that are very impactful for me. I then ask the students, really talk a lot about what are your teachers doing that is helping you to learn? And they share with me a lot of things, and a lot of things I see present in your classes. I then ask them, how many of you have ever told your teacher that? Basically, it's 0% of the time, right? So there's a lot of this kind of, students have a lot to share about how they learn. They have a lot of expertise in their own learning, and I've seen that grow as a function of the pandemic. So I do see that students have become much more kind of educated consumers of their own education, and so they're a lot more knowledgeable about who they are as learners. And so that's been really kind of impactful for me, is to have the opportunity to really learn from students. If the big goal is that we want to ensure that all of our students feel a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, love, passion for school. The question is, how do we do that? And more importantly, how do we do that without soliciting youth voice? So for me, student voice became critical to informing any of the work that I do within schools.
So, I mean, I think it's so important, and we do use a lot of, theater teachers use a lot of youth voice in devising and the creation of artwork. And many people here actually, I know, talk to their students and actually use them as kind of like advisory. But putting you on the spot a little second, do you have some thoughts about how these folks can kind of, if they're not yet engaging the students in those kind of conversations, like how to start? Not necessarily talking about the art itself, but kind of like what's impacting them in terms of the studio.
Well, I think you have to be intentional about how you use time. So if you think about your lesson planning and how much time you're allocating minute by minute, and I know you're DOE educators, so I get it, bell to bell, I understand that. I think that if we shift the focus from bell-to-bell instruction to bell-to-bell engagement, then we start to think about what are some things we have to back engineer to kind of foster that engagement. And so you might be intentional, purposeful in terms of allocating time to just have those conversations with students. Like I see those conversations, those connections as being foundational to learning. I mean, think about all the risk-taking you're asking your students to do right now. I'm sure many of you have children who are just resistant to try certain things, right? They're a lot more frustrated now, quick to react, right? Some of those things. We're living in these times, and so high emotionality, high reactivity, more and more students who've experienced not only learning loss, but spirit loss. And so it's important to kind of recognize, like, how do I privilege the time to build these connections? And more importantly, how does that then become foundational to everything else that I want to do? So getting that feedback, making those connections, those are the key things that I see are critical. So I think being intentional with terms of how you plan your use of time to include time specifically for that, I think will pay dividends for you.
And when we spoke, you talked about theater meeting students' developmental needs from your point of view, and that theater is actually a really good medium and forum for trauma-informed care.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
You know, we were talking about the idea we're coming, you know, our students have so much, are bombarded with so much to begin with. 5 years ago, your students were bombarded with so much. In the last 3 years, so much has changed, right? So much for positive, but unsettling, like the racial awakening, and of course COVID, which we can't pretend like we're back to normal. Everybody knows we're not. Right. So when we're talking about kind of trauma-informed care, maybe you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, so I think the first thing is to recognize the impact that these times have had on our students, right? And that the legacy continues. So I know that there's this kind of desire to act like COVID didn't happen right now and shifting back to the same old ways in which we did things. Right. You're recognizing that, right, in real time, that kids are still not all right, many of our students. Like, think about where we are. It's a DOE. We have about 72% of our students who are economically disadvantaged. We have about a tenth of our students who are experiencing housing insecurity, right? And so we're not even talking about food insecurity, other things. So we know that there's multiple stressors. We also know that for some of our students, they've lived in a legacy of that. And so there's the accumulation of those stressors over time. So we have students who have experienced stress, all of our students have. They've experienced an accumulation of stress, and many of our students have also experienced trauma, right? And so the question is, like, what do we do? How do we help to support? There's a lot of different models of trauma-informed care, and one that I tend to use really focuses on 4 elements. One is the idea of, in order to support students who've experienced stress and trauma, we have to build connections. Now, a lot of times when people talk about connections, they're talking about kind of personal connections, so peer-to-peer connections. But I think it's more than that. So students want to connect to you too. They want to connect to the people who's teaching them, right? It's that old adage of they don't care what you know until they know that you care. So they want to build that connection with you.
Can you say that again?
Sure. Students don't care what you know until they know that you care. All right. I didn't make that one up. I think it was like a Snapple cap or something, but
I wrote it actually.
Right, but it's something that stays in my mind a lot because I do think that that's the key piece. So that connections piece is important. But connections to what they're learning is also a huge piece. So it's also connections to learning, connections to the material that they're learning. That's a key one. And so I think like that's a space where activating youth voice. Who's telling the story? What stories are being told? What role do they have in telling that story becomes really important. The other aspect of this is also from a trauma-informed care perspective is this idea of safety. And I know that in these times we talk a lot about physical safety in schools, but we're also talking about psychological safety. And for all of you, this idea of building environments where students take risks becomes critically important. I was in one classroom where a teacher had on the board FAI, also the word fail. But instead of it meaning fail, it stood for first attempt in learning. And it was really a nice way to kind of build that growth mindset. Like, we're supposed to fail. I talk a lot when I talk with my students about as a scientist, like the book that I wrote, the book that you have right now, you should see the earlier versions of that book. Ooh, it's terrible, right? It was horrific, right? And so people read it and they say, this is garbage, take this out, change it. And then you end up with a final product, right? But it was the process that helped me grow as a writer. It's the same thing for our students. It's this process of trying and failing in which they end up ultimately growing. And then those ultimately become the big skills that you want your students to take with you. I'm a dad of, my wife and I are empty nesters right now, so my older kid graduated a couple years ago, my younger ones just started college. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about like what was the purpose of that preschool through kindergarten kind of education, like what was the big goal of all this? And I realized that there's this distinction that needs to be made between typically referred to as persistent skills versus perishable skills. And a lot of what we learn in school, unfortunately, are perishable skills. Like, we don't remember those things, right? We learn them for the moment, then we forget them. Anybody here remember what you did like freshman year of college in your certain class? Like, you forget some of that stuff along the way. But the big thing is, what's the persistent skills? And so I think that for all of you, the skills of being able to connect with others, to be more self-aware, to be more agentic, to be more confident, right? Those are the skills that are persistent skills. Those are the things that continue. Those are the things that helped my son go through multiple interviews before landing a job, right? Those are the key skills that are critical. So I think that for trauma-informed care approach, that level of creating that psychological safety in those spaces becomes important. We also have the third component of being more trauma-informed and supporting children who've experienced trauma is really about this idea of respect. And respect is really about youth voice. It's central to having trauma-informed care, is really elevating student voice, giving them a voice, giving them voice and choice, right, in processes. And then the last piece is around just emotional competence and emotional self-regulation. So again, we're living in a time for all of us, higher emotionality, higher reactivity. So how do you respond and how do you build skills to work through that? That becomes critically important.
Touching on a lot of things that we're actually going to double back on towards the end. We are filming this, so feel free to take notes, but also know that we're going to make this available for everybody so you can do it. One of the things that Gess and Dr. LeBlanc and I talked about that he wants to emphasize, and we'll do it at the end, was your agency to tap into what the school administration is telling you is important. Not just telling them what you value, but hearing what they value. These phrases like trauma-informed care and SEL, they're now using them all the time, even if, and they know what they mean, of course they do. But sometimes you can be the agent of change in that way and supporting them rather than saying, you know, finally, welcome to the table. So I just wanted to put that, we'll come back to that in a second. But Gess is giving you kind of some of the big ideas of trauma-informed care. Can you share the story you told me about the disengaged student?
Oh, yeah. So I was working not that long ago with a student who was a 7th grader, actually, who was not necessarily excited about school at all. Not math, I mean, sounds familiar? You may have some students who are like that, right? But he was really excited about theater, right? And so I happened to be in school one day where he got a lunch detention. And so I went and I sat with him to figure out like, hey, what's going on? So he told me that he got angry in class and he walked out of class and got upset. So I told him, I said, well, you told me the end of the story. Why don't you tell me the beginning of the story? Like what led up to that, right? And the issue for him was that he thought that he deserved to have more lines in the play than he got. And so what he did, which I thought was really brilliant, was he used the skills that he had developed in his ELA class around persuasive writing. He used his skills around data analysis in his math class, 2 classes that he was not engaged in at all. And he created the spreadsheet where he analyzed all the lines of all the other students, did a full table, and then showed me that the proportion of his lines was below, and then he talked about it from an equity perspective, right? And I was just like, that's awesome, right? And so we just sat there, and that just floored me, because it's like, here was a child who really wasn't engaged in the other content areas, but found the connection, right? And was able to demonstrate his competence in ways that educators didn't recognize. But what was happening is that people were reacting to his behavior rather than recognizing his strengths, right? And so that really resonated with me. That stayed with me a lot. And so that was just something that I wanted to share.
A great story. And think about you as the theater teacher. If that kid comes to you with justification from his perspective, or their perspective, of why the lines are disproportionate, what a great opportunity to then have the conversation about why. Right? Rather than kind of getting defensive about it and saying like, you know what, your cast is your cast and there are no small parts, only small actors, and no. This young person who's not been engaged is right there, right? And that's where we can kind of seize that opportunity. There's another quote you shared with me. I'm just going to read it. Sure. You said, a student said, in my other classes, I have to try not to be myself so that I don't get in trouble. In theater, I can be myself and they need me to be myself. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So so I have conversations with students about like why this theater experience matters so much. And oftentimes what I notice in theater classes is that students have the opportunity to really be their authentic self. And that's a huge piece for the kids, right? So I ask them like, so let's be real. Students are cutting classes but coming to theater classes, right? And so I want to know why, right? These are the things that I'm asking them. And they say, well, there's something about this class. And so we start to talk about that. And one of the big things for the students, they don't use this language, but I see it as interdependence, that the students need to be connected to people. The people there need them to have their role. The people that need, the other students, the teachers, that environment, they're needed. They have an important role to play. And the absence of their role harms everybody else. So it's this idea of interdependence where students feel valued, right? They feel that they matter. And it's just this power of I see you and I need you, right? The power of that is just resonates with so many students. And so this particular student just told me that, like a lot of times they're, and I think that it's important to kind of note this. Many of our students are compliant, but they're not engaged, right? You know what fake engagement looks like, right? Right. Like some of you are doing it right now, right? There's eye contact, right? You look eye contact, you're looking at me and nodding.
You saw her
Of course, I picked up a couple of people, all right? So we have students who are strategically compliant. They know how to look like they are engaged, right? And then we have certain students who don't have that skill, right? And so sometimes what we're doing is recognizing those students who just haven't developed that skill of how to play that game, right? But in our theater classes that I've been involved with, I see a lot more engagement. And what I mean by engagement, there's a cognitive aspect to engagement. There's a behavioral aspect. For a lot of students, the opportunity to move during a school day where they're seated a lot. Like, talk to your students about how much time they spend sitting down all day. Just have conversations with them about that. Right? In many middle schools and elementary schools, they've eliminated recess. So kids don't even have recess opportunities. Their physical education classes now also become mental health classes. So if you look at the standards, PE classes, oftentimes students are sitting down and having these other activities where they're not physically engaged. So students are oftentimes working against their own body's physical needs, right? And so they're trying to be compliant as best as possible. And then when they have spaces where they can actually have these different needs being met, they have their cognitive needs, they have these behavioral needs, and also these relational engagement needs happening, that's the sweet spot. And so I see that your theater classes are opportunities that really address those different levels of engagement. And in many other classes, the focus is really on the cognitive engagement piece. And so when children aren't engaged cognitively, the assumption is that they don't want to learn or they're not interested.
So I showed earlier, before we welcomed Gess to the stage, the different mindsets. And youth communications has other ones. I took the tier 2 because they were most actionable in my mind for our facilitators to be working with you. So the workshops you'll be doing today are informed by those mindsets. They're not necessarily, A to A, right? There can be a sense of them. So there's a playfulness to what we do in theater, but there's kind of like, what's the understanding behind it? Right. Can we go back to the mindsets, just go back a couple slides so we can see them, just so Gess has a reference point. Go back again. Yeah, no, go forward, forward. One more. Oh, we went all the way back to the beginning. Okay. Keep going, I'll tell you when to stop. Not yet. I think it's after this one. Next one, sorry. There we go. Okay, great. So we have 5, Gess. We don't need to go one by one, but you're familiar with these, obviously. Talk to us a little bit about this idea of mindset and why you think it's important in terms of their work.
So the mindset piece that Carol Dweck talks a lot about, this distinction, I thought that the video did a really good job of giving an overview of the fixed and growth mindset. But for us as educators, and I include myself in that, I'm a professor as a teacher, is really thinking about like, how do I foster mindsets in my students, right? And we start with thinking about ourselves, of course, and thinking about adopting growth mindsets for ourselves, but ultimately, we're thinking about our students. And so like, how do we move the needle and foster growth mindsets in our students? And so as a psychologist looking at this work, I think that the growth mindset piece becomes so critically important during these times, because for so many of our students, and we oftentimes worry a lot about the students who are underperforming, but I have to tell you that my high-performing students are ones that give me a lot of concern, right? So I have a lot of my high-performing students who have higher levels of anxiety, right? They're having a lot more emotionality, a lot more worry, a lot less risk-taking, because they're so focused on being that high-level student that they're afraid to take a risk that might somehow shatter their perception of themselves and their abilities. Does that make sense? Right? So you might
the perception of not just themselves, but how we perceive them.
Right, exactly. And so part of it becomes is, what kind of feedback do we give to students? What do we focus on, our attention? And so if we're praising students for effort, as was mentioned before, versus praising them for their ability, that's important for us to kind of think about the kind of language that we're using. But it's also, from my perspective as a developmental psychologist, Building growth mindsets is also about two things, motivation and also self-efficacy. So the self-efficacy piece is simply your belief in your ability to be successful. And so for a lot of students, you don't adopt this growth mindset unless you already have the self-efficacy that I believe that if I work hard, I'm able to be successful. And there are a lot of factors that can contribute to self-efficacy beliefs. And so simple things like what's referred to as vicarious experience. Have you ever tried to do something that you've never done before, like the first time you went horseback riding or the first time you went skiing, but you went with other people? And you said, you know what, I don't think I want to do this first. Let me let somebody else do it first. So you kind of let them be the crash test dummy, right? And then you watch them do it and they're successful. And then in your mind, you're probably thinking, if this moron can do it, then I know I can do it too, right? If you've ever had that experience, that's vicarious experience. And so when we are in our classrooms, students exposed to other students who are like themselves, who are able to be successful, helps them feel more motivated that they can too, right? So vicarious experience becomes really, really important. Just encouragement. So verbal encouragement, and what's referred to as verbal persuasion, becomes very important. So telling students that you believe that they can be successful and reminding them of that becomes important. However, that only resonates with students if you've already developed a connection with them, right? So if somebody tells you, hey, I think you're awesome, you'll do a great job, and you're like, who the hell are you, right? It's not gonna resonate with you. But if it's a student if you connected with, you say, I believe in you, like I know you can be successful, like that's very, very, very powerful, right? So that becomes a really important piece. And also just regulating, so helping students to kind of regulate when things go bad. How do you regulate and respond to your emotions? That's the self-efficacy piece. The motivation piece is a different side of this equation. And there's one theory around motivation that I think will be important just to talk about. And I just have to say that my mom says I have enough mouth for another set of teeth, so I know that I can kind of ramble a little bit. But the idea here is that the motivation piece I think is core because there's one theory, it's called expectancy theory, which I think is really important. Basically what we're saying is that our engagement in a task is based on our expectation of whether or not we're going to be successful or not. Nobody wants to participate in something that they think they're not going to be successful in. So you tend to kind of check out, right? And so for us as educators, in order to help children feel like they have the expectation of success, we have to address a couple different things. So for expectancy theory, one is referred to as valence. And valence just means the value. Like, why am I doing this? So you may have students like, why are we learning this? Why are we doing this? You might say, why am I at this PD, right? Like there are all these different questions that you're thinking about, which is like, what's the value in this? And so if you can establish the why, that becomes a really, really important piece. The other is what's referred to as instrumentality. And what that basically means is that there's a clear path towards the goal. So as you're working with your students, ensuring that they understand the steps that they need to take in order to experience a level of success, like clarity of instruction, that becomes really important for students, right? And then of course the last part is expectancy. And so what you may notice at times is students who expect to not be successful aren't just acting out or being disruptive. What they're being is avoidant. Right. And so they're avoiding something that they perceive will make them feel uncomfortable, make them feel as though they're not going to be successful. So why bother, right? So we're seeing avoidance. And so motivation, self-efficacy, I think that those are two areas that really undergird our ability to really foster a growth mindset in our students.
And we talk about the avoidance. We think about a couple of PDs ago, and in November, I showed the slide of kind of fight or flight. What does that look like in a classroom, right? Avoidance would be, right, flight. Right, talking back and fighting with you would be the fight, and we all want them to go towards the third leg, which is towards love and care, etc. Right. One other thing I do want to add that we've talked about, which I think is important, this idea of kind of like you knowing the students. Otherwise, praise is meaningless. Right. But you also would agree that one of the mindsets is high expectation.
Sure.
Because we all know that students have the most clear BS meters of anybody on the planet.
That's right.
Teenagers know when you're for real, and they know when they've put forth effort and tried really hard, and you're acknowledging that. And they also know when like they've slacked and haven't really done much, and you're praising them, right? Right. So that idea of kind of like, so maybe talk a little bit about how do we have high expectations that are not over our young people, right, but that we also don't go too low.
So it's interesting because oftentimes we make this, we think about expectations and things like empathy, right, and kindness and care versus high expectations, like they're two separate things. I think it's impossible to have high expectations for students without having empathy, right? Because we want to understand like how this learning experience makes them feel. We're trying to build that connection. That way we have high expectations that are also realistic expectations. Right? Like there's a difference between rigor and just hard. Right? And so sometimes what happens is we have students in situations that are just hard for them. not because they don't have the capacity, but simply because of the way that we've structured a task has made it just hard. Right? Rigor is essentially saying that I have my goals for all of my students. I expect you to be able to meet these goals. However, I also have to make adjustments necessary in order to support you to get to those goals. So we're setting realistic expectations, right? And that becomes the key piece there. And I think that's the important aspect of it, is like we can have rigor, but why? Like, what's the purpose of the rigor? What's the big goal, right? And establishing what the goals are and then helping students meet those goals, that becomes the key piece. I think that this also links to the prior conversation around mindset, because there's this whole line of work around what's referred to as attribution theory, and what children attribute their success or failure to has implications for how they engage in a subsequent task. So some of the studies have found that, similar to what Peter was sharing earlier, is that when students attribute their success or failure to their ability, then they very much are not necessarily as confident about how well they're going to do the next time around, because essentially it's this fixed mindset piece of, well, I just happen to know enough about this particular thing, the next time around I might not be so lucky. But when students attribute it to their effort, they're much more likely to be positive about the next task that they face. And so building an effort-based attribution becomes a really important piece as well here. So when we think about these connections here, like that's an important kind of through line that connects both of these areas.
We want to make sure that we do have time for Q&A. We're doing quite well, but a couple other things to get to that I think are really great for us to hear. This is great stuff, right? Amazing, right? Thank you. We're so fortunate to have you join us.
Thank you.
And you're not just an ally, you're a colleague, so we appreciate it. You caution against theater education being defined by other criteria.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We all know this, right? How many of you have had an AP or principal try to pigeonhole you by the Danielson standards that are not our standards, right? That are for general academic subjects. Now, just a word of, and note to myself, I need to resend out the specific considerations for Danielson, because a lot of you don't even know what they are. With the UFT's approval, I had several teachers work with me to write what does Danielson look like in a theater classroom. It's actually it's in the blueprint, believe it or not. So if you just Google the newest blueprint from 2015, it's there, and that's ammo for you, not to be defensive or even aggressive, but just to actually educate up, which a lot of us have to do, right? And let's just give a mental shout out to your principals and your APs. No matter how much you struggle with them, the pressures on them are insane.
Yeah.
Insane. Right. They got into this field to be educators and to have a culture shift in a school. And there's so much administrative and social emotional learning things that they have to care for, teacher attrition. So be very sensitive to that. Know that, and I've said this every time we've met, know that you are a theater teacher in a school, and the vast percentages of our schools don't have a theater teacher. So as much as you might feel frustrated by your administration, you're hired. And I'm not saying that for job protection, I'm saying that for like our kids.
That's right.
So really work on those relationships. Those of you that have great relationships with your administrators, awesome. Those that don't, find ways, as I've said before, there's 3 ways to be thinking about yourself in this world. Problem maker, problem identifier, or problem solver. Always be the problem solver. And I think that kind of goes along towards the growth mindset. Sure. So let's just take a second, talk to us about why is it important to tell our own stories? How do we define being evaluated, the qualitative versus quantitative conversation? You as a research expert, and these people as really qualitative practice people.
So first and foremost, I'm a mixed method person, and so I see the value in qualitative research, and so that a lot of what I do, and especially with my book, is really qualitative. But I want to kind of start by saying that as an evaluator, sometimes the blessing becomes the curse, and what I mean by that is that when I started first kind of coming into classrooms, theater classrooms, and kind of watching and learning as much as possible, I could clearly see the positive impact that it was having on students' social emotional learning. Right? And this kind of started before all the trends around SEL, right? So it was a really nice way to be able to talk about the impact of theater in classrooms to people who weren't really aware of what the impact was. And so it became a nice way to be able to kind of talk about in a language that other people understood. Now, with the advent of the New York State guidelines benchmarks that came out in 2018, along with a lot of other work that's been happening, even with things like the American Rescue Plan, where one of the goals, that's the federal money that from the Biden administration, supporting many schools in the city, one of the big goals was around supporting children's social emotional needs in culturally responsive ways. So it became a way to be able to kind of talk about how what you do impacts the broader goals of your building. However, over the last couple of years, what I've also been concerned about is that theater then became reduced to an SEL strategy, right? And so that's the caution that I have, is that we have to be able to tell the story in a much broader way, in a way that people understand, but we also have to expand their language. So yes, there are SEL impacts, but I don't see theater as some sort of a toolkit for SEL. I think it's much broader than that, much bigger than that. I don't see it as a mental health strategy. It's so much bigger, so much broader. So we have to be able to think about the language that we're using to capture our impact, right? To be able to then tell that story, because that story becomes critical, because it also informs how your impact gets measured. And for so many other fields, including theater, oftentimes what happens is you reduce what you do to match the measures that exist. So anybody here ever heard of the Devereaux scale, the Student Strength Assessment Scale, the DESA? You might have heard of the DESA. Yeah, they're using it across the city, right? So the DESA becomes like everybody's doing the DESA, that's the DESA, right? But what you don't want to do is reduce what you're doing to just the elements on the DESA, right? Because it's so much bigger than that. There's so much more there. So when I think about theater education, again, as an outside person who's had a little bit of inside, I look at the broader skill set that children are developing, the broader competencies. I think about it in terms of 21st century learning skills, right? Those are the core competencies that I see coming across the board, where the social emotional aspect is one of a much larger variety. And so what people like myself and others have to do is work with you to develop more sophisticated measures to capture what it is that students are experiencing and what you're experiencing in real time. And so these mixed method approaches and some of the work that I've had the pleasure of being able to facilitate with the Arthur Miller Foundation has enabled us to be able to solicit faculty voice, youth voice. In many cases, I also had administrator voice to feed into how people look at the impact, not just at the classroom level, but also at the school level. There's so many theater educators that I work with, oftentimes you're the only one in your building, I don't have to tell you that, but that you also have a ripple effect across your building. So when you're putting a production together, you're doing things where you have parents coming in, you have community members coming in, other faculty participating. And so you're also moving the needle not just at the classroom level, but also at the school culture and climate level. So there are a lot of different layers of impact that you're having. And so I just think it's important for us to really think about it in that way, so that way we can better advocate for the work.
Is that you, Margaret? So let's talk about the asset-based versus deficit-based conversation we had a little bit. Kind of redefining what normal is. Jess talked a little bit about it earlier, the idea of kind of like we're not where we were. We shouldn't pretend like we are, and we shouldn't romanticize the past.
Right.
So how do we move forward as teachers and some of the challenges that they're facing?
So there's a couple of things that and again, I spend a lot of time in school. So I'm working with students, working with faculty, and I ask faculty a lot about like, what are you noticing about your students? And oftentimes we'll have conversations about what students were like prior to the pandemic and what they're like now, what you're noticing, cognitively, socially, emotionally, behaviorally. And oftentimes what I notice is people are seeing students from more of this kind of deficit-based perspective of what they're not able to do that they used to be able to do, right? Students are different, right? We recognize that. We also recognize that the times have impacted in terms of why students are different. We also know that as adults, we're all different too, right? Like we've all been through some stuff and it's changed us all. So if the students are different and we're different, then it's important for us to not just do the same thing in the same way, right? So it's important for us to adapt, to change our expectations, not lower them, but just responsive to the reality that we've changed. And so as I think about just classroom instruction, it's a lot of feeding into that idea of what am I noticing in my students? Does that represent the new normal? And more importantly, what can I do based on what it is that I notice? So for example, how many of you have noticed students who seem to be a lot more emotionally reactive than they might have been in the past? Just by show of hands, right? Right. So you're noticing that. Anybody feel students are a lot more needy? Like coming, can I help you with this? Right? So you're feeling more of that neediness, right? So you're seeing some of these things. These are common things. Like look across the room, how many hands are coming up, right? So we're seeing all these things. The question is like, why? Like what do we understand to be some of the root causes behind this? So if we think about some of the work around things like executive function, so executive function, memory, problem solving, like those kinds of things, and then we see the impact that stress has on executive function, then what we're seeing for a lot of our students, and even for some of ourselves, is executive dysfunction, right? So anybody here more forgetful? Like you notice that during the pandemic might be more forgetful, right? Students more forgetful. It's called being a human being, right? It's not a deficit, there's nothing wrong with you, it's what happens when we're under these high levels of stress. So there are some common things that we're seeing among all of us that we have to kind of recognize. It impacts our brain, right? So amygdala responses, so there's more emotionality. We notice that we're having more kind of even hippocampal aspects, so there's around like how we are processing and regulating memories. Those things are also being impacted under stress. So those are all realities. And so the question is like, what do we do? And so part of it for us is to really think about how our instruction can be organized in ways that support those who are experiencing executive dysfunction. So you might even have to think a lot more about like how many things you ask your students to do in a row, right? You might think about that, like you could give them a couple different steps and now you have to kind of chunk it. How you present your information, the use of more kind of graphic organizers and much more detailed information for students to help them organize cognitively what's going on. Also consciously thinking about ways to not be an additional stressor. So the clarity of what you're doing, the clarity of your expectations, all those things matter, right? Because again, we can contribute unknowingly and essentially trigger some of the behaviors that we then end up reacting to in our students. And so these are just things that I've just been noticing for a while and working with lots of teachers to really think about how they can change minor pivots in practice that are very much aligned with what we know about the impact that stress and trauma has on the brain.
I mean, just let's put it back on us. Think about it for a second. I was just thinking of, as Jess was talking about, how many of us have been driving on the highway in a rainstorm and the radio's on loud? What do you tend to do with the radio? You turn it down because there's just too many inputs coming, right? That's what's happening with our kids. Or think about if you're at the beginning, you're in front of the classroom and you're setting up and the kids are being needy and they're coming in and the kids from the last class want to talk to you and the kids coming in want to talk to you, and it's overwhelming, right? And you're like, guys, just give me space. Just give me a minute, right? They're going through that also. And so I think that idea of kind of, and we talked about this online, about the idea of kind of maybe asking less of our students in terms of the amount of work and thinking about the quality of the experience of work and scaffolding it that way and letting them go deeper with fewer prompts.
Right.
Does that
No,
make sense?
that's exactly spot on. I mean, I've been doing a lot of changing in terms of how I even teach my classes. And I've thought about a fewer, more signature assignments with more depth, rather than the kind of scattershot approach that I've been doing prior to that with a lot more information, just a lot more stuff I was having them to do, but the quality of the stuff really wasn't capturing what it is I wanted them to capture. So I've been very, very thoughtful about like the kinds of assignments with their feedback. So I've asked a lot of my students to give me feedback. I guess the biggest thing that I've been thinking a lot about, because as part of this conversation, is rethinking how I think about what it is that I do. And so for me as a teacher, I focus a lot more on this idea of, I ask myself this question, and I would encourage you to do the same thing, which is essentially, what am I going to do today that's going to make them want to come back tomorrow? And that's essentially what I've tried to use as I think about my instruction, I think about my connections with my students, is really at that level, because ultimately that's what it's all about, right? That level of engagement, right? That level of connection.
And it doesn't mean theater games, right? We all know that that kind of is a slippery slope of kind of like, well, they love theater games, so I'll just keep doing theater games. Because that just is like a kid to candy store and they get nauseous from so much candy. Right. So the idea of the interdependence, what factors make them want to come back because they don't want to let down their friends, they want to contribute, they want to be heard. Right. Let's turn it out to you. We can't bring the house lights up, I apologize. But just not show of hands, raise your hand if you have a question that you'd love to ask of Jess. In the back, nice and loud, and I'll go around. So in the back I saw a phone, that was a good way of getting our attention.
Thanks.
Morning.
I was wondering, early on in the conversation, you were discussing the incongruity between what teachers think activates their students educationally versus what students think activate them educationally. What conversations can we and should we be having in our classrooms? What questions should we be asking so that we can get to that answer on their end easier?
So one of the things that I ask, that's a great question. I ask my students, and I encourage teachers I work with, just to ask the students, what are some of the things that I'm doing that help you to learn, right? And we have these conversations where we talk a lot about just, when you do this, this helps me. I also ask them to talk with me about like what are some of the things that make it more difficult for them to learn, right? And we talk at the classroom level, but also outside, right? And so those are the kinds of conversations that I would encourage you having. And those don't have to be large group conversations. You can have smaller groups, smaller pockets, even one-on-one conversations with students. I think the biggest thing for students is that you seek to understand. And asking a question like that oftentimes stops kids in their tracks because very few teachers ever asked them that kind of a question. So that's something that I would encourage.
And I love how he framed the question. It wasn't, hey, give me feedback on my teaching, right? It wasn't this open-ended. It is, what am I doing that helps you learn? What am I doing that might be a bit of a challenge? So that it frames it so it doesn't become this kind of like dump on you in terms of kind of like, well, you're not there for us, or, you know, it's very specific. Other questions? Yes, right here. Nice and loud.
Yes, I was wondering,
That's a fantastic question, and it took me years of experience to be able to answer your question by talking about what it is. So I'll talk about my failures and then talk about what I found to be successful. And so when I did it just at the level of the classroom and getting feedback from students, and I have the privilege of being able to do focus groups with kids, and I go into classrooms, I ask the teachers to leave and let me just chat with their students, right? So I'm able to do that. The only way that I was able to essentially move the needle was to start from the perspective that it's not sufficient to just seek to understand, that we have to do something with what it is that we're hearing. And so what I've been able to do is then move from individual classrooms and groups of kids to actually working at the building level, and in many of the districts I'm in at the district level, where the feedback that I've been getting from youth have been able to inform practice. And so what I do is that when I gather information from my focus groups, I then have meetings. So I do meetings with, so even faculty meetings. I might be at a high school and I'll meet with the math department, for example, and I'll share out some of these things specific to saying, like, here are some things that you're doing that are helpful, here are some of the challenges. Now that we know, what do we do, right? And we start to establish these kind of, okay, here's what we're learning, here are some things students are saying that are helpful, what are some pivots in your practice that can align with that? Because the big thing for me is in the districts that I'm working in, one of the things I didn't share is that my focus is also around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so what I've been doing is building committees at the district level and many districts in the metropolitan area. And the big piece of that is youth voice. And so I don't want students to feel as though they've been heard, but then there's no action that's being taken, right? So it's not just a listening tour. And so for me, it's important. So I've been able to move the needle more so when I've had the upper administration also involved in recognizing the value of youth voice, and then having forums to be able to share out what it is that I've learned. The other piece that has been very helpful is that I solicit questions from the teachers that I ask the students. So the questions aren't from my head, right? So I meet with faculty and say, what do you want to learn more about the kids, right? Sometimes faculty say, like, I can't ask this question in my class, or this is not the right forum. But I can do that as a more objective person and being able to then bring that back to the faculty. So I found that to be very, very helpful. It's very difficult sometimes colleague to colleague to change the mindset of a colleague around the value of youth voice. It concerns me that there are a lot of adults who don't see the value in those kind of connections, right? So that's a different conversation. But I feel as though instituting practices at the building level also helps students recognize that people care about what I have to say and that there's steps that have been taken. I go the next step of I tell the students to hold us accountable. So now that you've raised these concerns and we said we're going to take these actions, like, you need to come back and check us, right? To let us know that we're doing things.
And I think framing it is super important. Mm-hmm. Like, when are you having these conversations with these kids? Right. And saying, this is a conversation, I'm going to do my best to try to address this, mm-hmm. not promise them, because right. all of a sudden letting them down, asking and then not responding could be even worse than, right? So it's the power of low-hanging fruit. So there's oftentimes easier actionable items that you can take at the beginning, and you just kind of prioritize, right? There's things that might be immediate changes, and there's things that might take more time. But I think the fact that students see you seek to understand and that there's a strategy for how to move it forward, that's respect for them. I know I saw a hand. So I hand over here. Yes.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on students. I mean, like, I hear what you're saying. I understand. I mean, like, everything is strategic. Mm-hmm. But when you have students that have already made the choice that they do not want to participate. Mm-hmm. I've kind of come to this place where, like, the exertion of energy to mm-hmm. try to, make them like me, make them like the experience, adapt everything to individual needs. When you've reached an impasse and when they're literally just sort of annexed, you're done, Right. I've kind of come to a place where I'm not forcing anything, right. Like almost kind of this let them come to me approach, mm-hmm. kind of like wondering what your thoughts on that are.
So I completely hear what you're saying, and I understand that. And another part that I think I hear you also saying is that, what's the opportunity cost of investing this much time in this particular student at the expense of the other students who were trying to get engaged, right? So you have to kind of work that calculus out in your head as well. The student that you describe is a student who may also have other needs that you're not able to meet, right? And so part of it for me is, if I were to talk with you more, is also about, like, who's your circle within your building? Like, who are you also checking in with to kind of get more insight into a particular student? So I work with counseling teams, for example. So I'm meeting with school counselors, I'm meeting with school psychologists, I'm meeting with social workers to see if there's other backstories that can help me to better understand the student who's sitting in front of me. And sometimes, not only are you not the right person to do that, but also sometimes because your proximity to the student, it actually makes it harder to make that connection. Because if the student, so for example, some students associate your content with you as a person. And so sometimes if they're uncomfortable with the content, they're also uncomfortable with you. And so it makes it harder for them to connect with you. And so when I'm asking about like who's in your circle, it's about like who else might be someone with insight into this child to kind of think about, well, is this my class? Is this multiple classes where I'm seeing this? What are the spaces where the student manifests the same kind of behavior, right? And what are some of the triggers? Because if it's a consistent across the school day, that's one answer. If it's a particular content area, then that's a different kind of a thing, a different kind of an approach. You follow what I'm saying? So I would be curious about who else may have insight and knowledge about this child to get a better sense of, what I can do to make a connection.
And I love that also, because not just what might be happening in the other classrooms where the kid's acting out, but where they're succeeding.
Yeah.
And a colleague might be saying, they just love to write poetry. And you wouldn't know that. And so is there a way in on that one or not? So finding out both what triggers, but also where the success is. We have time for one more question, then we're going to do a wrap up and head out to our studios. So right here,
That's
yeah.
okay.
This is a question about that social hierarchy that exists in middle school.
Sure.
And how to support students who are finding themselves at the bottom of it, where other students aren't wanting to work with them. They're also afraid that their lack of popularity is contagious if they were to.
Yeah.
So how to help in that kind of situation.
Well, it's interesting that you say middle school, because particularly right now we're seeing like the peer relations piece. I don't know if you've noticed, like when kids were coming back, they were just not as kind to each other. Yeah, right? Like, like everybody like, no kidding, right? Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding,
Exactly,
ding, ding.
right? Yeah. I was trying to say it really gracefully. Everybody like, yeah, they're mean. Yeah, they're just being nasty, right? Like they were having a hard time like relating, So part of it is there's skill pieces there about like how to develop those kinds of connections and how to build empathy. Because for middle schoolers particularly, a lot of the things that I'm noticing is that there's a they don't really necessarily understand the difference between intent and impact. So they might feel like, I didn't mean to hurt their feelings, but I'm like, yeah, but you did, right? Like, I didn't mean to get, so helping them to kind of understand, even though you didn't intend it, this is the impact that it had. So that's why some of the restorative practices that I see in theater classes can be very, very helpful in helping kids to kind of recognize, like, if you're treating someone a certain kind of way, then not only does this harm this child, but it harms our community, right? And so helping kids to kind of understand the ripple effect. So that's one aspect of it, right? The other is, I think, the interdependence piece becomes a key piece where you have students in different roles that are vital for the operation of everything else. So we don't function if particular students don't fill their roles. And so what that does also is kind of elevate the status of kids who may have lower status to say, like, they're really important to what we do, right? And so thinking about that interdependent piece becomes really important. But I think it's a combination of skill building for kids, and that's kind of like this empathy and restorative practices, I think is one way to do that. And you can leverage things you already do. I've been in so many classrooms where you've been using circles as a warm-up activity. Circles are integral to restorative practices. From a cultural responsive perspective, there are cultures all around the world that come together in circles when it's time for mediation, when it's time to build connections. So you have a space already in place to be able to kind of employ some of these like restorative circle practices. But particularly for middle schools, I think there's a competency piece. There's also an awareness piece about the difference between intent and impact. But then there's also some strategic things that you can do to kind of elevate through interdependence, kind of like the role that certain kids play within your classroom. And I'd love to talk more. We can talk more.
And I love that idea of, look, lean in on I jokingly said about theater games, but I'm a huge fan of them with intention, right? Mm-hmm. And so think about what theater exercises or games kind of show off the value and power of the individual and make sure that some of those kids who maybe are on the peripheral can be central and leading, something like that. And even something like Zip Zap Zop, which kids do ad nauseum, the idea of it is not necessarily elimination, although they love that. But if you lean in on how long can we keep this going and fast and switching and zipping and zapping and zopping, not to out, but to be a sophisticated level of the ensemble. And then you realize, oh, we are interdependent, and then you can have a reflection about that conversation, not about me or Jess personally, but just as an ensemble. So are you okay, Jess, if people who didn't get their questions asked, if they email them to me, if I send them to you?
Oh, not at all.
Of
course, it's fine.
Great. So
Yeah,
if you had a question, just email it or text it to yourself. You can send it to me. We'll get back. Dr. Gess LeBlanc, everybody.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you very much.